that this different arrangement does make sense. And I would agree with you. I think it makes sense from the standpoint of physiology. Take wood, for instance. Why does the Tang Ye Jing ascribe an acrid flavor to wood? Well, we know from this sort of network of resonance or network of associations that wood goes with springtime. If there's emotion that's associated with wood, it's dispersing, it's
I'm Michael Max, and this is Geological. I've been thinking lately about enough, just enough. Usually, this is a response to my patients when they conflate more needles with better treatment results and they say, "Load me up, doc." But I've also noticed that this idea of, air quotes here, covering the bases by adding a few more needles seeps into my thinking when I'm feeling insecure. When in fact, I'm lacking clarity about my diagnosis, and so I add a few more needles with the hope that something sticks and it will be helpful to my patient. I don't like the feeling of not knowing, especially when I'm supposed to be the expert and when I've got an eye toward making sure the patient has a positive experience because, well, we're all in business, and repeat business is what keeps the lights on. But adding more, especially when those additions come from trusting a theory or something someone told me, instead of a clear understanding of the dynamic that I'm seeking to skillfully intervene on, that usually takes me further away from clarity. And even if I do help, I don't know what helped. And while perhaps the patient has the outcome that they were seeking, I'm no closer to increasing my understanding of the medicine than I was when I began working with them. I see it as kind of a lost opportunity. Lately, I've been working on simplifying my work in clinic. I ask myself, what's the one significant change that I'm looking to make in any given situation? I'm not looking to do less for the sake of doing less work, but rather so I can see more clearly the results of the intervention. This really makes me nervous at times when I'm not clear on the diagnosis because without a sense of clarity, crafting a simple and direct intervention is difficult, perhaps impossible. And like you, I want to do well by my patients. So standing in that place of not knowing, it's deeply uncomfortable. Self-doubt is never fun. And so when I think, I'll do a couple extra pins to cover all the bases, I know that for me, it's time to double down on dialing back and clarifying my diagnosis. And even after doing that, there are plenty of times I'm still not completely sure. So here's what I've been doing lately to get more clear. I treat simply the one thing that seems to be at the center of what's going on for my patient in that particular moment. It could be a branch manifestation, it could be a root cause, but I treat with enough simplicity that regardless of whether I'm right or wrong, the response from the patient will help me to clarify, so I've got a better idea how to be more helpful in the future. How are you with willing to be wrong on the way to get it right? I'm not talking about being sloppy in the work that you do. I'm talking about being precise and then having enough emotional fortitude to take a misstep and turn it into valuable information that allows for clearer diagnosis and treatment. But it takes simple and directed treatment to get that kind of information. Those few extra needles to, quote, cover the bases, it might make us feel better in the moment, but I'm not sure in the long run that it's helpful to our patients. All right, let's get into today's conversation. All y'all's out there that have a taste for classical medicine, you're going to love this one. We are looking at the medicine of flavors as it's talked about in the Tang Ye Jing, the classic of soups. This discussion gets into the therapeutics of flavor and how we can think about herbs with an eye toward the 5 phases. Let's get to it. These conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members. All the sponsors here provide helpful products or services that you'll find beneficial in your clinical work. Want to get better at treating concussions and other neurological conditions? Clayton Shoe has some innovative methods. Blue Poppy, your new one-stop shop, has speedy shipping options on everything that you need for your clinic. Later in the show, Jane offers you helpful suggestions on how to raise your rates, and Golden Flower Chinese Herbs shares a journey of healing that I think you'll recognize. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Geological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast. Picture this. Your clinic is buzzing with patients, and then you realize that you're down to your last box of needles. No need for panic, because Blue Poppy, your one-stop shop for all your acupuncture needs, they ship orders received before 3 p.m. on the same day. With a quick visit to Blue Poppy's website, you can order premium needles, herbal formulas, and that special Dr. Bob's oil that your patients love. Blue Poppy understands practitioners can't keep patients waiting. That's why they strive to get you what you need when you need it. From high-quality Chinese herbs and formulations to acupuncture supplies and clinical essentials, Blue Poppy has served practitioners for nearly 40 years with products that meet the highest of standards. Discover everything Blue Poppy has to offer by visiting www.bluepoppy.com, and don't forget to subscribe to their mailing list for exclusive offers and more. Ever found yourself listening to a geological conversation and thinking, wow, I needed to hear that? Yeah, me too. And I never know when I'm going to hear a guest say something that stops my world and reboots it with a larger perspective. If these conversations have ever helped you to feel more grounded, more inspired, or just less alone in this strange and wonderful work we do, consider becoming a member or supporting the podcast with a bit of tithing to the donation jar. It helps keep the lights on here at the Geological Sound and Motion Lab so that we can bring you these conversations every Tuesday morning. You'll find all the details at geological.com. Thanks for listening and for being a part of this.
Hey there, I'm Cameron Jafari, an acupuncturist from Los Angeles. So I started learning nanopuncture from Dr. Clayton Shu because I was facing these complex neurological conditions like stroke and MS in my clinic, and I just felt like I lacked a solid process to treat them. Brain-related issues always felt like a whole different animal, and I was looking for a clinical system that worked and could guide me through them. So after attending my first nanopuncture seminar, I was able to apply the process pretty quickly and with pretty amazing results. I remember the first stroke patient I saw afterwards was a guy who had a stroke 2 years back, and he couldn't talk at all. And after a few treatments, he started saying a few words. And a few treatments after that, he could actually have conversations. It was pretty incredible. So this is why I feel like nanopuncture is the future of acupuncture neurology. And you can be a part of that. Their next seminar is on treating concussions and is being co-taught by both Dr. Shu and Dr. Ayla Wolf in New York City on April 26th and 27th. To learn more, visit nanopunctureseminars.com.
Hey, fellow Geologicians. Welcome to Geological. My guest today is Joshua Park. I came across Joshua, I think, over on the Distraction Machine, actually. I try not to spend too much time there, but on occasion I do. And there were some great articles that he had up there about the Tang Ye Jing. Now, the Tang Ye Jing, for those of you herbalists, you're probably shaking your head going, oh yeah, the lost classic. And for those of you that are not herbalists, buckle up. We're in for a great conversation. We're going to get into all this stuff. Joshua, welcome to Geological.
Thanks so much, Michael. It's great to be here.
I'm delighted to have you. Now, there's so many places we can start. I'm just going to start with one that, it's like doing an acupuncture treatment. You wander around all the channels eventually. So, first of all, you're a fairly new practitioner, right?
Yes, I just graduated in 2017. I would say I'm pretty green, pretty fresh.
Fresh out of the blocks. That's great. At the beginning of our career, hopefully throughout our career, but especially at the beginning, it's all so fresh and new. It's just a perfect time to explore. I am curious to know how you came across the Tang Ye Jing and what sparked you up with this thing.
It's a great question because, as you said, a lot of people think of the Tang Ye Jing as this lost classic. And to some extent, it is kind of a lost classic, but fragments of it have been preserved in another work. And that has kind of come down through different Chinese herbal medicine lineages. I just kind of got exposed to it a little bit through my training. So I studied at the National University of Natural Medicine. which one of the co-founders of that school is Heiner Freuhoff. And there's also a number of people there who studied with Dr. Arnaud Versluis, and both Dr. Versluis and Dr. Freuhoff are students of Dr. Zhang, probably pronouncing his name wrong, Dr. Zhang Rongxiu.
Yeah, Dr. Zhang.
Yes, exactly, Dr.
Zhang or
Zhang.
Zhang? Yeah, I can't remember it either, but yeah, he passed away a few years ago, unfortunately.
He did, but his students are keeping his work alive, and certainly within that lineage, there's a lot of attention paid to the Tang Ye Jing. So just going to that school, people would mention it, they'd bring it up. One of my herbal teachers, Michael Givens, had this really nice chart of all of the herbs in the Tang Ye Jing arranged according to this sort of five phase or five element pairing, basically. And so it was always something that was kind of, I guess, sort of just in the air in my training.
Yeah, lucky for you.
Yeah, I went to a really special school, and I feel really blessed to have had all the teachers that I've had.
So you've been writing about the Tang Ye Jing. I mean, at this point, are you reading it in English? Are you reading it in Chinese? Where are you getting access to sort of the source text, so to speak?
There are people who have delved really deeply into the text. I'm really just looking at a very basic set of passages, and you'll see if you pull up any of my articles that I'm basically just looking at the section that assigns each of the herbs to a particular one of the five phases. That's really it. I'm just saying, okay, Xiaoyao belongs to metal. It's the earth of metal, and that's pretty much it. So I'm just taking that statement and I'm kind of running with it. I'm saying, what does that really mean? What do I get out of that statement? If I look at the way that, say, other classical texts that we do have more and fuller access to, like the Shen Nong Ben Sao Jing, or like the Shanghanlun, the Jingwei, what does it really mean to say that Xiaoyao is the earth of metal?
I mean, that's a great question. Can you unpack that for us? Help us understand it a bit?
Absolutely. What seems to make sense to me, just looking at these very basic lines from the Tang Ye Jing and then kind of cross-referencing them with other classics, is that it's kind of saying that to say that Xiaoyao is the earth of metal means that it kind of takes the activity of metal and it transports it into the realm of earth. That probably seems very abstract, so part of what I'm doing in this article series too is trying to say, okay, we've got these abstract diagrams of the five phases and different herbs are assigned to them, but what does that really mean clinically? It actually makes sense if we think about the activity of xiaoyao. If we think about the way that that herb is used classically, it's often used for abdominal pain, for instance. The abdomen is the realm of earth, so we know right away, okay, it's doing something to the abdomen. That makes sense. That's the earth. Where does metal come in? Well, in modern TCM, I think we often describe xiaoyao as having a softening effect on the liver. And so what that means is that it's taking metal, which we know controls wood, and it is able to kind of buffer the activity of wood controlling earth. And if you look at the indications for xiaoyao in the classics, you'll see formulas like xiao jian zhong tang or gui zhi jia xiaoyao tang. That poetic metaphor of taking the activity of metal and bringing it into the realm of earth, I feel like describes the function of those formulas very well.
This is really interesting because the way that you just described it brings in the whole cycle
Yes.
of the five phases because you're taking Xiaoyao, and because it can soften and calm down the liver, that's going to pull it off the spleen. And so the spleen has more ability to unfold itself in the way that it needs to unfold itself.
Exactly, and of course, there's that very famous passage, I think, in the very opening chapter of the Jingwei, where it says, the skilled physician, when the liver's diseased, they don't just treat the liver, they understand that a diseased liver is going to affect the spleen, and so the skilled physician will also address the spleen as well. That's kind of a perfect example of that principle. All of Zhang Zhong Jing's formulas really are perfect exemplars of that principle of not just treating something directly, but seeing the sort of broader dynamics of pathology and physiology.
Sure. Well, so often we are taught to look at not so much what's the problem, but what's the dynamic? If you can understand the dynamic, you can bring that to treating almost any kind of problem.
I think that's really the key to so much of Chinese medicine, and I think that that is, the key to a classical approach in particular is to be focused on the dynamic and understand the dynamic. And if you can just, resolve the dynamic, everything just kind of unfolds to its optimal state of functioning.
I want to step back for a moment and come back to the lost classic aspect of this and dig into the history here. And then we'll come back and talk more about herbs because I'm kind of an herb geek. I love that. But I'm curious to know, you say it's come down through other works. Can you give us a bit of a timeline or help us to understand how we still have aspects of the Tang Ye Jing in our modern day?
Fragments of it are preserved in a work called the Fuxing Jue Wu Zhang Yong Yao Fa Yao. Hopefully, I didn't butcher that too much.
We'll put
Um,
it on the show notes page.
yes, that's probably a good idea. And that the title of that translates to something like auxiliary secrets for treating the Zangfu using herbal medicine, or you could possibly also translate that as kind of rhymed herbal secrets for treating the Zangfu. This is a work that's attributed to Tao Hong Jing, who was a Taoist alchemist, the founder of Shangqing Taoism. He lived kind of in between the Han and the Tang dynasties, I believe, and within this work, there's large sections that are either quoting the Tang Ye Jing directly or making reference to it. And this text itself, the which is I often just shortened to the Fuxing Jue, that basically was itself a lost text until the 20th century, when it was rediscovered in China. There are some questions about its authenticity. There certainly were when it was first discovered, but for the most part now, I think most people basically accept it as an authentic text. I'm not really a huge scholar of Chinese history. I have a general sense of the sort of the basic outline. I'm certainly not an archaeologist, so I really can't speak to the authenticity of that document. But I will say, if we look at the sections of the Tang Ye Jing that seem to have survived in it, and we just look at the sort of 5-phase logic that they contain, and then we apply that to formulas in the Shanghenlun, in the Jingwei, it all seems to make a tremendous amount of sense. And we do know from looking at other texts that there was a direct influence on Zhang Zhong Jing from the Tang Ye Jing. Even texts that are basically unrelated to herbal medicine, like the Zhenzhou Jia Yi Jing, for instance. If you read the introduction to that by Huang Fumi, he specifically mentions, yes, there's this text called the Tang Ye Jing. It deals with formulas, and Zhang Zhong Jing, was influenced by this text. There's references to that, and then I think if we look at what we have in the Fuxing Jue, the fragments of the Tang Ye Jing that have survived, it becomes clear that there's definitely some level of influence. Probably the most obvious is that there's a number of formulas there, sometimes under different names, but that are almost identical to formulas that you see in the Shanghanlun. For instance, there's a formula called Xuanwu Tang. Xuanwu is the black tortoise. He's sort of the directional god of the north. And that's very similar to a formula called Zhenwu Tang that we all know in the Shanghanlun. There's clearly a connection.
Yeah, big influences.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're talking about how the herbs fit within the 5 phases. Is there also a way of looking at the herbs from the Tang Ye Jing's point of view that would associate them with, say, one of the Jing, one of the 6 levels?
To be just very frank, I haven't looked, I would say, very deeply into the Tang Ye Jing, honestly, past these sort of basic assignments of the herb to different phases. From what I can tell, though, it is largely kind of a 5-phased based perspective, which is very interesting because, we all know that the Shanghanlun and the Jingwei Yaoli, for the most part, the way most people think of the formulas in those books and the way that Shanghanlun in particular is arranged is according to a kind of a Liu Jing framework. So it's interesting to bring in a 5-phase framework. And I feel like what you can do is if you just have this very basic understanding of this is how the Tang Ye Jing arranges these herbs according to a 5 phase framework, and then you kind of layer that over a 6 conformations framework. That can bring out just a very interesting perspective on how to use herbs, a very interesting perspective on formula architecture.
This episode is brought to you by Zhen, the clinic management software that I use to keep my practice running smoothly. So, let's talk about something that can be a little bit uncomfortable: raising your fees. I know, this is something that might feel awkward, but it doesn't have to. With a bit of planning and care, you can handle it in a way that feels right for you and your patients. One tip: give yourself at least 2 months to prepare. This gives you time to get comfortable with the change and let your patients know what's happening. You can share the news through emails, booking reminders, or even just a friendly little sign in your clinic, and avoid over apologizing. Instead, keep it straightforward and matter of fact. Keeping things consistent across the ways that you communicate can really help avoid confusion. Fee increases aren't always easy, but you're not on your own here. For more tips and ideas on how to communicate these changes with confidence, check out frontdesk.chain.app and look for the article, How to Tell Your Clients You're Raising Your Fees. Oh, and one last thing, if you're ready to give Jane a try, use the code CHIOLOGICAL for a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. Well, it seems to me what you're talking about with the Tang Ye Jing, and from my small amount of looking into it and study that I've done, it seems to be talking about, I'm going to call it, the way that proper physiology works. It's not really looking at a model of pathology as it's looking at, here's how things work when they're working properly. Does that sound right to you?
Yes, absolutely. I think that is really at sort of the heart of the way that the herbs are arranged and even the way that the flavors are assigned. This was to some extent my reaction when I first encountered the Tang Ye Jing, and just the arrangement of flavors was, what the heck? This completely is the opposite of what we've learned. We know that sour goes with wood, but here the Tang Ye Jing is saying that sour goes with metal. We know acrid goes with metal, but the Tang Ye Jing here is saying that it's ascribed to wood. Everything just seems to be backwards, particularly when we're students of Chinese medicine. We're just trying to get the basic foundations. It can be very frustrating because it seems like there's all these different systems that all arrange things very differently. And if you're looking for just sort of a single solid key to everything, it can be a very frustrating experience.
Forget it. It's not going to happen.
Right, but if you're able to step back and understand that these are all just different frameworks and different models, we can basically switch between them fluidly, but that there's also sort of a deep interrelationship between them. We can appreciate that this different arrangement does make sense, and I would agree with you. I think it makes sense from the standpoint of physiology. Take wood, for instance. Why does the Tang Ye Jing ascribe an acrid flavor to wood? Well, we know from this sort of network of resonance or network of associations that wood goes with springtime. If there's emotion that's associated with wood, it's dispersing, it's spreading outward. What is that? That's what the acrid flavor does. There's a deep physiological reason why the Tang Ye Jing has kind of inverted the sort of normal flavor relationships. I talk about this, I think, a little bit in the sort of introductory segment. Those normal flavor relationships, I shouldn't say normal, the standard ones that we know, they come up in numerous chapters of the Su Wen, but there's also kind of a Neijing basis for the way that Tang Ye Jing organizes the flavors. And you'll find that in chapter 22 of the Su Wen, that discusses the 5 flavor associations we find in the Tang Ye Jing side by side with the more standard arrangement. And it's interesting because it says that the flavors assigned to the 5 phases by the Tang Ye Jing tonify their respective organs. So acrid tonifies the liver. And we can think about what that means again if we think as you were suggesting that we do in terms of physiology. If the liver wants to spread and disperse, because that is the movement associated with wood, that is the movement associated with springtime, it makes perfect sense that acrid would tonify that. What we mean in this context by tonify is sort of accentuate that natural physiological function of
Right?
spreading.
It's normal. The normal thing it wants to do is to go outward.
Exactly,
And so
exactly.
the acrid takes it further out. So, and I'd like to go around the wheel with you for people that are new to this way of thinking. Let's hear all of them so that people have a basis for getting what we're about to talk about.
Sure. So the Tang Ye Jing basically it says that acrid is associated with wood, salty is associated with fire, sweet is associated with earth. That one at least is the same. Sour is associated with metal, and bitter is associated with water.
So we usually associate bitter with the heart,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And we usually associate salty with the water.
Yes.
It sounds like the way that we learned it in school that, for example, sour with the wood, that's actually what helps control the wood.
Exactly.
Salty is what would control the bitter.
Yes.
And then you got earth in the center. Earth is just earth. It's hanging in the center.
Exactly, exactly. I'm not sure if you'll have kind of a visual model of the Tang Ye Jing on the page, but yes, exactly. This is not just a five-phase model, but this is a five-phase model with the Earth in the center.
Right. Well, we can certainly put one on the show notes page. I think that's a good idea for people that are trying to, wrap their mind around it. I mean, whenever we first hear a new idea, it seems the initial response is, "What the heck? What are they talking about? What kind of nonsense is this?" Especially when it goes against what we've been told is the correct way. But again, we're looking here. This is just something I've been toying with a lot. I'm going to use the term proper physiology. So the proper physiology, the thing that makes something, that promotes something, like you were saying, acrid for wood, but we know sweet for earth. For the fire element, salt would actually promote the fire. How does that work? How does the salty flavor promote the heart? Have you got a sense of that?
I should mention that the Tanya Jing series is ongoing, and it's kind of ongoing in the order that I'm exploring these. So I haven't really delved very deeply into fire just yet. This series is just sort of me almost thinking out loud, just looking at these relationships and then sort of cross-referencing with the Shen Nong Ben Sao Jing, and then cross-referencing with formulas that use the herbs that are in the Tanya Jing. That said, if we think about the activity of fire, and we think about the activity of summer, for instance, summer is about growth and expansion. What does the salty flavor do? The salty flavor kind of softens things. And I think we can think about the activity of fire as kind of softening things. When you heat something up, oftentimes
Hmm.
it
Heat
it
softens
softens
things.
things, it dissolves things, and so in that sense, I think the salty flavor, it's sort of optimizing that heating, dissolving quality of fire. That I would say is probably kind of a prerequisite to the expanding and growing quality that we associate with fire and with summer. Um,
Yeah,
I'll probably
I'll
have
look
a
forward to reading what you come up with on
thank
that.
you. I was gonna say I'll probably have a more comprehensive answer once I dive into those herbs. But that's just the sense that I get at this point.
Well, thank you for your work with this. I think it's a really generous thing to take something that you're in the midst of learning, you're putting pieces together, and before you maybe have it all completely figured out, you say, here's a work in progress. Check it out. See what you think. Generate some conversation. So often I think a lot of us, we prefer to wait until we like really get it before we throw it out there. And then there's throwing things out too soon, but putting an inquiry out so that we can have a conversation, that's so helpful in being able to puzzle through medicine.
I really hope that that it does stimulate a conversation. And yeah, that's absolutely what I'm trying to do, is just sort of think out loud. And again, yeah, I welcome any comments or conversations that are sparked by my work.
Is all of your work being published on Facebook, or are there other places for those of us that have attention issues, like your host? Are there other places where we could go and read this? Because I got to tell you, when I go to Facebook, 20 minutes later, I'm trying to remember why I went there. That speaks to my issues with attention. But I'm wondering if there's any places that you've got on the interwebs where if we just wanted to go and have a conversation and kind of read what you're doing and maybe talk about it. Have you got a website or anything like that these days for this?
I don't have a personal website myself just yet. That is something that I'm working on, but all of the series is basically being published through Chinese Medicine Central. So you can see basically the whole series on ChineseMedicineCentral.com, which is a website run by Eric Gray. He's a student of, well, rather, he's a practitioner in his own right, but he has studied with Dr. Arnaud Versluis. He practices Chinese medicine in Astoria, Oregon, and yeah, he's got this website, Chinese Medicine Central, that publishes really a range of material that I think would be very interesting. He's got material kind of on practice management. He's got some CEUs available there. He's got a blog. He's been very generous in letting me kind of work through this on his website. And he publishes all of the Tang Ye Jing series there.
Okay, that's great because I prefer to read it there than Facebook. So glad to hear that's in the works there. You talked about how looking at the herbs through the lens of the Tang Ye Jing, which again, I'm going to come back and call it proper physiology, when overlaid with the 6 levels, can bring another way of looking. The thing that I find interesting about this is that the 6 levels seems to talk more about pathology, what happens when things are not working right. It seems like there's this double level of thinking that can come from this study where if you understand how something's supposed to work and then you can overlay it on a situation where it's not working, maybe something else comes into view for how you can use it. I'm wondering if you have any experience with this.
That's an interesting point. The physiology versus pathology. And to me, I think it's sort of like we can choose to view things primarily physiologically or primarily in terms of pathology. I would suggest we can absolutely, even though maybe we think of the Liu Jing more in terms of pathology, we could absolutely view it instead in terms of physiology, in terms of function. I think the key to that is this concept of sort of opening, closing, pivoting. If we think in those terms, we can sort of reframe the Liu Jing in terms of physiology. And in general, I would say that's a perspective I try to cultivate within myself, is emphasizing physiological function rather than some pathology that has to be eliminated or expelled. Sometimes I think that's a useful perspective clinically, but more often than not, what I've found, and granted, I'm certainly a new practitioner. I don't have a ton of clinical experience just yet, but from what I've seen, I find it is almost always better to view things in terms of physiology. I think that opens up, I would say, if nothing else, more possibilities in terms of strategies to implement. And I certainly think that in terms of how we view our patients, it's better to view things in terms of physiology. And I think that can open up a more positive perspective for them.
Yeah. Well, if we're trying to fight disease, all right, that's a battle. But if we can take aspects of our physiology that already are working perfectly well and bring it to bear on the areas that need some help, and those areas naturally could help that, it's like just shunting some water from an area that's got too much to an area that doesn't have enough.
Exactly.
Things just naturally take their course.
Exactly. And I think if we look at any of the formulas in the Shanghunlun or the Jingwei, that's sort of really what's going on. Is I think that these formulas are working with physiology. Even formulas that, if we think about them as sort of trying to expel a wind cold pathogen, for instance, what is that doing? You're using the body's natural ability to sweat, to eliminate something. You're working with that. You could say you're working with the natural function of Taiyang to open, for instance. That line of thought, I think, is very close to what Zhang Zhong Jing was after.
hmm Let's dig into this a little bit. What I think I heard you say, let me just double check this, is that in looking at the open close pivot aspect of the Liu Jing, we can begin to get a sense of proper function of each of these different levels.
Yes.
So, and we're just talking about the Taiyang. So, can you walk us through what a healthy, proper functioning Taiyang looks like and acts like from the perspective of it's this, it's Taiyang, it's the greatest outside, it's associated with the small intestine and it's associated with the urinary bladder. So there's an aspect of both fire and water that come into the Taiyang in that way. And it's got this opening aspect. So what does a healthy Taiyang look and act like?
That is a huge question, but I think the key, is always about balance, right? So the function of Taiyang is to open, and so what you're looking for is something that is opening just enough and not open too much, and that is able to, open fully to its fullest expression. I think the way that can manifest, there's really so many different ways. I mean, you look at the Shanghanlong and something like 60% of the book at least is just Taiyang. That should clue us in that the functions of that aspect of the Liu Jing is an enormous topic. In terms of just basic herbal medicine theory, we all know Guizhi and Ma Huang Tong are kind of the two Taiyang formulas. So a case where Taiyang is open too much, where the exterior is a little too susceptible to external stimuli. That's more of a Guizhi pattern where things are too open, or rather, opening is not regulated properly. Ma Huang Tong, you could say that's a case where things are too closed, where the Taiyang sort of fails to open. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. Yeah. I mean, those two formulas are indeed exemplary formulas for just this kind of thing, especially the Bai Shao in that Guizhi, helping to astringe and constrain so that you don't lose fluids. And then you've got the Ma Huang to open up a dynamic that it wants to open, but it can't quite get there. Talk to us a little bit about open close pivot and why these are important. And more importantly, how you would consider using these aspects in your clinical work.
For me, I think they're sort of the key to just, again, seeing things in terms of proper physiology. And in terms of how that plays out clinically, you can look at any given patient, I think, and our first instinct, I think, is to say, where is one of these functions compromised? And then that leads to the next question: how do we restore normal functioning or optimal functioning? At the same time, we can also think about where are things functioning, what aspect of the physiology is functioning in a healthy way, and then how can we use that to kind of guide our intervention, I guess, or how can we use the resources that presently exist to address a problem. It's probably a huge topic of debate, which Shanghanlun formula is the most useful, which is the most used. I would suggest probably a lot of people would say that Xiao Chai Hutang or its modifications are probably some of the most versatile, commonly used formulas in clinic. And why is that? I would suggest that it has to do with that sort of importance of the pivot. And if you can get the pivot functioning correctly, that will sort of clear up a lot of other issues.
Imagine this: a patient walks into your clinic. They're carrying more than the pain in their body. There's a story there, a history woven with the stress of long days, the ache of things unsaid, and the quiet longing for something to shift. You listen, not just with your ears, but with your hands, your intuition, your heart. It's not just about needles or a formula. It's about connection, understanding the threads that tie us together, mind, body, and spirit. That is where golden flower Chinese herbs comes in. Rooted in tradition and crafted with care, their formulas are more than herbs. They're a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern practice. Every bottle, a quiet partner in your work, helping you to meet your patients where they are. Because healing isn't just about treating symptoms, it's about creating trust, cultivating belonging, and helping someone feel truly seen. Golden Flower Chinese Herbs, your partner in practice and connection, where tradition meets care. Looking at the Xiaoyang as pivot makes a lot of sense. That one I can grasp pretty easily. But the pivot on the inside of things, that's the Xiaoyin, correct?
Yes.
So what's going on there? I mean, when I was in school, we learned that the Zhui Yin, was like the end of yin, and it's the separation of yin and yang. It always seemed to me that, well, the Zhui Yin was kind of a pivot into something else as well. I can see how the Zhui Yin could also be seen as a kind of a pivot. In fact, Hu Shu and Feng Lin talk about it that way. But understanding the Xiaoyin as a pivot is a bit elusive to me. Can you help me to grasp the pivoting function of the Xiaoyin? And especially from the point of view, in this case, of pathology, what would I be seeing in someone that would lead me to think, oh, their Xiaoyin isn't pivoting?
If you just think of kind of the basic Shaolin presentation, right? You've got somebody who is the pulse is faint and thin, and there's desire only to sleep. I think that's line 281 of the Shanghanlun. If we want to think about this in terms of the seasons, that's somebody who's stuck in winter. As we move into winter, the days get shorter. There's more darkness. Things are cold, but eventually you get to the winter solstice. And from that point, that's sort of a pivot, right? It's like there's more light after that point. There's more warmth. Somebody who we would describe as having pathology in the Shaoyin, it's as if that moment where yin turns to yang, there's something is not happening there, and so they remain in this yin state. And this is happening at a very deep level within them. The pivot that's not happening is the pivot of the imperial fire, and so the pulse is faint and thin. You'll see signs like frigid limbs, diarrhea, et cetera. All of these signs that we describe in terms of kidney or heart yang deficiency, if we're thinking more
Right.
in
I
a
mean, it's
Zhang
very
Fu
much a yang
framework.
deficient presentation.
Right, absolutely. So I would say that the pivoting aspect there is it's as if you're not able to pivot out of the darkness of yin, essentially.
So this brings me back to the question of proper physiology, because a diseased Xiaoyin is cold. And yet when we look at what the Xiaoyan organs are, well, you got the heart. It doesn't get much hotter than that. And then you've got the kidney. Now the kidney is interesting because we have the deep cold water of the kidney, but also in the kidney, right, we have that original yang that's stored there. We have the Mingmen associated with the kidney. So it seems that throughout the Shaoyin, there is also this deep, deep aspect of fire that needs to be present.
Absolutely, and this is where it's very interesting to kind of overlay this five-phase model with a Liu Jing model, because from a five-phase model, it's emphasizing water with the kidney, but the Liu Jing model sort of directs us to this idea of imperial fire.
hmm So I'm curious now, as we're having this conversation, if we go and look at the water herbs, what is the fire herb of water?
So fire of water is Huanglian.
Huanglian is the fire of water.
The way I would make sense of that is if we think about the formula Huanglian Ejiao Tang, which is also treating a Shaoyan condition. But that's treating a Shaoyan condition, where it's more of a heat or a yin deficient presentation. So how would we understand Huanglian as being the fire of water? I would suggest The way that we understand that is that it's bringing the activity of water into the realm of fire, and so if you think about the presentation of sort of a Huanglian Ejiaotong pattern, you've got insomnia, you've got vexation, you've probably got lots of heat signs. The idea is that sort of the heart is overheated essentially, and the function of Huanglian there is to bring the activity of water into the realm of fire, cooling off that heat, sort of soothing the vexation. I would suggest that sort of model or that dynamic that I identified applies to any of the herbs in the Tang Ye Jing.
This to me is the really fascinating thing about looking at the herbs through the Tang Ye Jing. There's all kinds of ways that I already have a thinking about things, but when I start looking from the Tang Ye Jing point of view, man, it's like the wheels come off the bus.
Absolutely, it's wild, and it I can't speak to this sort of archaeological validity of these arrangements of herbs, but it just seems to make so much sense.
Yes, clinically, we can see how it hangs together, but only after a bit of investigation and really looking into it. Like you were saying, we've got down in the water, the fire herb is Huanglian. I was totally expecting you to say Fuzi.
Futsa is the water of wood, which is interesting.
We're going to get into that in a moment. But this whole idea where what you're doing is you're taking the activity of water and you're moving it into fire. Oh yeah, Huanglian makes total sense now, right? That just like snaps to grid.
Absolutely. That's been my experience with most of these. Some of the herbs are ones that we don't use a whole lot. Something like Shuen Fu Hua, for instance, which is the fire of fire. I think that pretty much only shows up in Shuen Fu Daijia. I haven't gotten to that one yet, but in terms of the ones that I have explored, it all seems to snap into place if I just take that basic 5 phase framework, look at the way that Zhang Zhong Jing uses those herbs. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Okay, so just for fun, let's look at this from the other side, the other perspective. What is the water herb of fire?
So the water herb of fire is xiaoshi, which I'll be honest, I don't even know what that is.
Wow, I don't know what it is either.
So that'll be interesting when I get to that, exploring
Okay.
exactly what that one is.
All right, good. We got a little mystery here. That's always a nice thing.
Absolutely.
Let's look into Futsa. Futsa is the water herb of wood, did you say?
Yes.
All right. How's that work?
Well, I would say going back to your initial question about, Shaoyin disease, um, when we think about when Futsa is indicated, it's indicated when you have that yang deficient Shaoyin presentation. And so what that's doing is I would say that's bringing the activity of wood into the realm of water. And so it's taking somebody whose presentation we could say is stuck in kind of a winter presentation where everything is locked down, and it's taking that warming, moving activity of springtime and it's bringing them out of winter into spring. It's allowing Shaoyin essentially to pivot from yin into yang.
Because you're bringing that acrid, warm spring breeze to melt
Exactly,
the snow that I'm
exactly.
looking at as we record this right now outside my window.
Oh wow. So
Yeah.
that's a metaphor that has just an immediate application for you.
You listeners out there, I'd love to hear your comments on this. But for me as an herbalist to begin to think about taking one aspect, like taking the fire of water. So what that does is it moves the water energy into the fire.
Yes.
I mean, we do this with needles, right? Where you can transfer energy. I mean, there's all kinds of 5-phase correspondences where you can pull energy from one of the channels and transfer it to its 5-phase correspondence, right? You can take it over to whatever is the controlling element, or you can take it into the mother element, or there's all kinds of ways that we can do these transfers with needles. And what I am hearing you talk about with the Tang Ye Jing is there are exemplary herbs, and I suspect there's other herbs that are related to them that would do a similar thing, but we're literally using these herbs to do a transfer through the five-phase energetics.
Exactly. And to me, that was also something that stood out when I first started really exploring this, was that this is very interesting for somebody maybe who is more familiar with acupuncture than with herbs, and particularly for people who utilize, there's many different acupuncture systems out there that utilize the sort of five transport points or five antique points, five shoe points, however you want to call them, that are doing this all the time with acupuncture, as you said. So it's very interesting to look and consider and see how we could do this with herbs, how we already are doing this with herbs within the Tang Ye Jing and within the fragments of the Tang Ye Jing that we have preserved in the Fuxing Jue. There are sets of formulas that are discussed putting these herbs together. I don't really go into that really at all in the Tang Ye Jing series that I'm doing. Another practitioner, Michael Del Orfano, has already done that in collaboration with Heiner Feuerhoff. And his work is available on classicalchinesemedicine.org, where he kind of goes in and looks at the formulas in the Tang Ye Jing. And so the Tang Ye Jing will have a minor tonify the lung decoction, a major tonify the lung decoction, a minor sedate the lung decoction, a major sedate the lung decoction that's combining these herbs in such a way that you are tonifying or draining the respective organ. I've read his articles, and I've looked at how that works. I've compared it to the way you would tonify or drain, kind of using the five transport points with acupuncture, and it's not quite the same. And I think that reflects the difference in modality between acupuncture and herbal medicine. But it's very interesting that it's that same dynamic at play. But what's interesting to me is that, if we consider the influence that this had on Zhang Zhong Jing, anybody who uses a classical formula I would say, is already engaging in this kind of tonification and draining process, even if they don't realize it.
So even if we're just like, say, straight up Shanghanlin practitioners, there's actually this kind of blueprint in the background that we can also access if we decide to dig into this and look at these other ways of thinking about relationships with the herbs across the phases.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
You do acupuncture as well as herbs, yes?
I do, yes.
Okay. I'm wondering how your study of the Tang Ye Jing has affected the acupuncture that you do, if it's affected it at all. I'm just wondering how it might come into your clinical thinking when you're working with needles.
I would say my style is still kind of evolving. That said, I became interested in kind of exploring the Tang Ye Jing very deeply around the same time that I've become more interested in working basically more with the five transport points. I've always emphasized them, but increasingly I feel like my style is one that kind of uses those more primarily. In terms of the acupuncture systems that I'm interested in exploring, they're all increasingly ones that kind of favor or emphasize either the five transport points or kind of a five song perspective, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting how we study one thing and it kind of infects what we're doing in other places. It actually, I don't think it can not change how we think about things in other places. It's
Absolutely.
part of the fun of what we do.
Totally, everything is connected, and for me, that's what's great about Chinese medicine, is that it's able to encompass everything. I feel like to an extent that nothing else I've encountered, really does.
Well, certainly if you enjoy the process of inquiry, you got a lifetime supply of it with this stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Joshua, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners here today?
Nothing I can think of, honestly. Yeah, I think that's probably everything.
All right. Well, I'll have information on the show notes page about where people can find the ongoing inquiry that you are so generously sharing with us. And any books or any other items that you think would be of use to the listeners, just let me know and we'll put it on the show notes page so people can get access to this stuff.
I'll definitely think of a few things and let you know. That sounds great.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you for the work you're doing. I look forward to reading more of it, and thanks for taking time to sit down for a conversation with me today.
Oh, no problem. Thank you, Michael.
Well, here we are at the end of this episode. If you've listened up to this point, you're either a rabid fan of Qiological or the forward button on your podcast player stopped working. If you are indeed a fan of the podcast, you can help us to bring new episodes to our community of practitioners by supporting us with a membership or a one-time contribution. Details, of course, are on the website. That's it for today, friends. Join us again next Tuesday for another thoughtful episode of Qiological.